Hi, I'm Ryan Kittleson, and welcome to Maya Retopology for Animation. In these videos, we're going to use Maya's modeling toolkit, which allows us to take a raw sculpt or scan and build a riggable model out of it. I'm going to show you how to plan out good edge flow so that the character can animate in a natural way. Then I'll get into the actual construction of the new polygon mesh. I actually really enjoy the process of retopology. It's a fun combination of artistry and technique. By the end of this course, we'll have a fully modeled character that's ready for rigging and animation. So let's get started with Maya Retopology for Animation. While this is an intermediate level course, I'm going to show you every button and keystroke that I use and explain everything I'm doing to make it easier to follow along even if you're not very experienced with Maya. As long as you know the basics of navigating the interface and viewport, you should be fine. If you need to get up to speed with the software, please watch the Maya Essential Training course that matches your version number. The first 3 chapters should be fine. If you have access to the exercise files, you can open the one that corresponds to the video you're watching by simply double-clicking on it or dragging and dropping it into the Maya window. Okay, with that out of the way, we're ready to get started with the course. Before we can create a nice, clean model for animation, we should have a sculpted or scanned model to work from. Then we can use that as a shape to retopologize on top of. Usually this comes from a 3D scan or digitally sculpted model. In this course, I'll be using a character that I sculpted in ZBrush, so let's bring it in and take a look. So in Maya, let's just go up to File and Import. And under the exercise files or free exercise files, you should find an elfsculpt.obj and go ahead and import that. One issue that you might run into if you're using your own file is that it might be a very heavy mesh. Let's go ahead and click on this and zoom in and see what this looks like. So you can see this is made up of a lot of polygons, but it's not so much that it really bogs down Maya. Now, if your model is really heavy, what you might want to do is go up to Mesh and click on Reduce with Options. And what we can do is reduction method by percentage, and just find a percentage that works for you. You might have to experiment a little bit, but let's just see what happens on 50%. So it's going to think about it for a little bit and strip out some of the unnecessary polygons. Okay, let's go ahead and close this window. And you can see now that the model is less dense. Now sometimes your model might be so dense that you can't even bring it into Maya in the first place. In that case, you'll want to do a reduction or decimation in whatever other software you created the model in. But I'm going to go ahead and undo this because I liked the density of triangles that I currently have in this model. Now another thing I like to do is assign a blend material to the model. You can see the default material isn't very shiny, and so it kind of makes it a little bit hard to see some of the forms in this sometimes. So what I like to do is select the model, right click and hold down the right mouse button, and come down to Assign Favorite Material and pick Blend. Okay, so now if we deselect the model by clicking in an open area, you can see that we can really visualize the forms and surfaces much easier when there's a highlight on the model. And let's do one other thing. To make it easier to see the new topology that we're going to create on top of this, let's make this blend material slightly transparent, or actually mostly transparent. Let's go into the attribute editor for this model and find that blend material. And let's go to transparency and just drag this mostly all the way to the right. Okay, so now you can see, we can still see the model pretty well, but it's going to be transparent so we can see the more important retopology on top of it. Finally, I like to put the sculpt on a display layer so that I can easily hide it or make it a reference object so that I don't accidentally select it if I don't want to. So let's click on the model one more time. Let's come up to our channel box and layer editor, and let's go to layers and create layer from selected. Now we can double click on this, and when you double click on the layer name you can change it. So let's change it to something like raw sculpt and click save. Okay, so now if we deselect this, we can hide it just by turning the visibility for this display layer on and off. And we can also turn it to T mode. The T means it's in template mode, which means it's a grayed out wireframe view, and also you can't select it. So let's go ahead and click this one more time. The T mode isn't very useful. Now when it's in R mode, that means reference. So it's actually going to display like normal, but you can't accidentally click it. So this is a good one to leave it in while we're doing the retopology. Okay, and if we click it one more time, it just goes back to regular mode where you can select it. Okay, so now our raw sculpt model is prepared for retopology. It is semi-transparent with a material that makes it easier to see the forms, and it can be easily hidden or disabled with a display layer. So now we're ready to plan out our retopology. When retopologizing, I sometimes jump straight into building the new mesh. However, if you're uncertain where everything should go, it makes sense to plan it out first by drawing some guidelines. In this video, I'll be mostly covering the technical details of the process so that we can get into the edge flow theory in the next few videos. So let's check it out. So to get started drawing our guidelines, go ahead and select your raw sculpt. Now if you can't select it, make sure that you're not in template or reference mode. Make sure it's in regular mode. And then we want to go up here to the live surface magnet and go ahead and click that. So what that does is it makes it a live surface. Any new curves that we draw are going to get drawn on the surface of this model. A quick note about live objects. If you save your scene with an object as a live surface, and then you open that scene later, Maya will not remember that the surface was live. So if you're using the exercise files for this course, you'll need to reactivate the live surface for the raw sculpt with each exercise file you open. Now let's start out with some really simple curves in some really obvious places. It kind of goes without saying that we're going to want our new topology to follow the shape of the eyelids. So let's go ahead and get our curve tool out, and I'm just going to click around this eyelid. Usually I wouldn't even draw this curve because it's so obvious that the new topology should follow this eyelid, but just for practice, let's go ahead and do that. Now when you're done drawing that out, go ahead and hit enter. So you'll notice I'm just doing this on one side of the model. That's because the model is symmetrical, so I really only need to plan out half of it. Okay, let's go ahead and make another curve somewhere else. So let me zoom out a little bit. It's also something that goes without saying that you want to have your edges running down the center of the model, but just for practice, let's go ahead and either hit G on the keyboard to activate the last used feature, or just go ahead and click on your curve again. And I'm just going to draw a curve, just clicking out, going up halfway. Now it doesn't matter if it's slightly deviating a little bit, that's okay. Just going to draw this going up the center line. And then once it's this far, it really doesn't matter exactly. It's pretty obvious that we're going to want to follow that center line, but just for practice, go ahead and hit enter there. And then we can continue this curve. We can just draw a new one. It doesn't really matter if they're not like precisely connecting up. But I'll just draw this out. Just clicking around this nose. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard to see. That's okay. I'll just bring that down into the mouth. Go ahead and hit enter. Now if you need to modify any of these curves, you can do that by holding down the right mouse button to get that marking menu, and we'll go into Control Vertex. And then if you need to select one of these and maybe hit W to go into your move tool, maybe slide this around a little bit, you can do that. And notice as we slide this, it's sticking to the surface. So we couldn't just slide this off into space. So that's kind of helpful. It keeps us on the surface of the model. When you're done making edits, you can just hold down the right mouse button, go back to object mode, and you're good to continue working. Okay, if you feel like you need to practice some more, go ahead and create some more curves either in really obvious places where you know you're going to want to have that edge flow follow, or along the center line. Okay, in the next few videos, we're going to be getting deeper into exactly where these guidelines should go on the rest of the model. Flow zone is a term that I made up, partially because it's fun to say, but also because it gets at the idea that there are parts of a model that can be thought of as sharing the same structure. Areas where the edges all flow together in a neat grid. In some places, it's very obvious where the new edges should go. For example, following the smile line right here, or making a tube structure down the arms. However, other places might need a bit of planning to get right, especially in the spaces between major facial landmarks. Let's see how to sketch out some exploratory edge flow to help us retopologize faster and better. As you can see, I have the raw sculpt model already set up as a live surface, which you can tell because the magnet icon is highlighted. Just a reminder, if you're using the exercise files in this course, you'll have to reactivate the live surface every time you load a file. Okay, so like we did before, let's go up to our curve tool and just start building out some areas that are maybe not as obvious as we had done before, but are still fairly clear as to what should be done. So for example, we want to have an edge that follows the smile line or nasal labial fold. Now sometimes we might not know exactly where to bring it. Perhaps this edge could have come a little bit farther down or maybe a little higher up. So sometimes you might want to just kind of do your best guess, and if it seems to be in conflict with other edges we create later on, we can always delete it and change it or make modifications. So let's try some more. Perhaps we want to have one that starts at the bottom of the nose and kind of follows more on the inside of the last one we created. And hitting enter to lock that one in. And let's see, we're probably going to want to have some more going around the eyelids. So let's do the same thing again, and we'll just create a curve that follows that shape. And I'm partially following what I see in the sculpture, and then in other places where it's not quite so obvious, I'm just kind of guessing where that should go. All right, let's lock that in. So the major flow zones are the mouth, of course, and the eyes, but there's also some important ones around the brow, for example. So we want to have the brow locked into a flow zone. Now it might not be clear where this should go from here. You know, should it follow up around here, or should it maybe go into the mouth? It's okay if we leave it where it is for right now and kind of figure that out later. So we'll just lock that in. And let's see, we're going to want to have something that follows the jaw. So let me start drawing one from the middle here and just kind of bring it around the jaw. And again, you know, it might be kind of mysterious. Should this keep going up this way? Should it kind of go behind the ear? We can just leave it where it is and kind of figure out those more ambiguous things after we've already established the more important edges to follow. So we're definitely going to want a little bit more around the mouth. So I'm just going to draw out one more coming around this way. And let's see, let's bring this one, probably pretty certain it's going to want to come up to that center line, so I'll just bring it up to there. And there's a few other places that are pretty obvious, for example, following around the nose where it meets the face. It might not be totally clear where it should go from here, so you can just kind of leave that open. Something else you can do at this point is create some edges that go perpendicular to the ones that we've already created. So we know that there's going to have to be edges basically running perpendicular to these, and let's see where they might go. So if we create one right here, we can see that it just kind of crosses up and goes up into the eye. So this can help us to establish where some more of these edges should go. So really it's a process of just picking edges that are the most obvious, and as you establish more and more edges, other edges that you should create will also become apparent. So it's pretty clear that there should be probably an edge going from the corner of the eye to the center line. And it's pretty obvious that there's going to be some that go from the top of the eye and follow up the head. And it's probably pretty clear that we're going to need another set that kind of follows around up at above the brow. And again, exactly where this goes can be a mystery right now. We don't have to figure everything out at once. So you can just kind of continue this process of picking areas that are pretty obvious, building off of those, and finding more areas that are going to be obvious, but don't force yourself into something where you're not really certain what should happen. You know, with this one, it's pretty clear that this should continue down the neck, but if something isn't clear, don't force it. You can always find some other angle to approach every area from. Okay, so a lot of heavy lifting is done now for the face. Some takeaway things to remember here are to keep things light and general. Don't worry about where every edge goes or the specific of every little detail. We just want to establish the most important edges for the major flow zones. Here's where retopology can really get into the weeds. We're trying to map a simple grid structure onto an organic surface, which is never going to come out perfectly. However, there are some ways of thinking about the process that can help. Let's look at some real-world examples and how to solve them. Okay, so let me take a closer look at the face. You can see that for the most part, we're trying to create a grid-like structure that's made up of four-sided polygons. And generally, the vertices are going to connect to four edges. So, for example, there will be a vertex right here, and you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 edges that will connect to that. And that's generally what we want. Now, sometimes we can have triangles, usually in areas that are never going to be seen, or that are very hidden or aren't going to deform. But there are some things we definitely don't want. For example, we don't want 5-sided polygons, and we don't want vertices with 6 edges coming out of them, or 6 pointed stars. So let's take a closer look at one of these areas. If I zoom in really close here on the brow, you can see that we have what would turn out to be a 5-sided polygon. So let's get our curve tool out and see how we might solve this. Now, one way you might think to fix this is by drawing a curve from that point in the middle and bringing it down into the eye. So this does fix the issue of having 5-sided polygons. So now we've got 2 4-sided polygons and 4-sided polygons here, which is great. However, this will result in a 6-pointed star. So you can see that this vertex here would have an edge here for 1, 2, 3, 4, and then mirrored on the other side, 5, 6. So this would not be very good. So I'll just delete this one. All right, let's think of some other ways that we could solve this. Generally, with 5-pointed stars, what you want to do is you want to locate one of the vertices and then create a new edge that will divide it into 2 4-sided polygons. So we did try that here up in the center of the model. However, that creates a 6-pointed star. So we have to pick one of the others, and not this one, it's also in the center, but we could say, continuing from this one, going up the forehead. And what we want to do is evaluate how useful this new edge is going to be. Now we've already got an edge that's fairly close to the center line, so adding a new edge there really isn't going to help much. So I'm just going to Control Z and undo that. And let's see, maybe this way. So this is also creating more edges where there's already a lot of edges. It's already very tight. So we'll just undo that one. So the best way to solve this one is to create a new edge that goes across this way. And this is going to be useful anyway because a lot of times there might be a facial expression that requires this area to sort of scrunch up. So you want to have another edge here. So that works well. So let's find some other areas that need some help. Same issue down here. I'm going to solve this one by sending a new edge from a 5-pointed star here and across the center line. Now let's take a look at one that's a little bit more complicated. We have one right here on the cheek. Now there's not always one way to solve this that's the best every time. We could go from this corner and send it across the nose. We could go from this corner and go up into the eye. We could go from here down around here, but probably the best way is to put the 5-pointed star right in the middle of the cheek and then send it around the brow, because we know we're going to need some extra edge loops around the brow anyway for the deformation that's going to happen there. Okay, let's take a look at another one here on the lower cheek area. You can see we've got one. We could send one down around this way. We could send one this way or up over that way. This one actually could go a couple different ways. I'm just going to send it like this because I know we're going to need some more edge loops in the side of the mouth because that's an area of high deformation. Okay, so solving these various special cases is often as much an art as it is a science. Now don't worry, you can always change your mind later on, even if you've finished the whole process. It's just better to work these areas out at this stage now because it's more work to fix them later on. So the basics to remember are triangles are okay, but as long as they're hidden and in an area that's not going to deform very much. And no 6-pointed stars. And you want to make sure you're resolving all of your 5-sided polygons into 4-sided polygons. Now that we have the guidelines all laid out, let's organize them so that they're easier to work with. In this video, I'll group them and put them in a display layer so that it's easy to hide them or make them non-selectable. Okay, so we've got all our guides here. So what we can do is just click and drag over everything. This selects the body as well. So I'm just going to control click on the body to deselect it. Now we can hit Control G to group all of those curves into one group. So you can see over here in our outliner, it's now called Group 1. I'll just double click on that and I'll just rename that guidelines. Okay, and while I've got this selected, let's go ahead and make a display layer for this as well. So let's go to our channel box and layer editor and go to layers and create layer from selected. And we'll just double click on layer 1 to name this guides layer and save. Okay, so now we can hide this or make it visible again, or we could turn it to a template layer or a reference layer so that it's non-selectable after we deselect it. Now we can't click on that. Actually, if we turn that to a reference layer as well now, so none of this can be selected. So this is useful if we create that new topology on top of this. We don't want to accidentally select any of these other layers. Now that we've done this, we can still create more guidelines if we want to. So let's just do something like that just to see what that looks like. So I'm going to make these regular layers again. And let's go ahead and make sure that this elf sculpture is a live object. So just making sure that that is now made the live object. And so let's go ahead and create a new curve on this just to see what this looks like, making a new one now that we've already created those groups. So let's say we want to define a little bit more of the guidelines around this area. Let's say it's a little bit vague. We want to clarify it a little bit. So let's make a new one here. Hit enter to lock that in. Okay, so we've got this new curve, and you can see it's here in our outliner. It's not grouped with the rest of them. So with this curve selected, I want to shift click on the guidelines group and then hit P to make that curve part of that group. So now when we hide the guides layer, that new curve will get hidden as well because the guides layer is hiding that group. Okay, now that we've got everything organized, we're done with this chapter. In the next chapter, we're ready to move on with creating the actual new topology. Now that the flow zones are planned out, we can get into the actual mesh construction. For this, Maya has a set of features called the Modeling Toolkit. Let's see how it can be used to make the process fast and easy. Okay, in our exercise file, the way I've got it right now, the raw sculpt is in a reference layer. So what I need to do is get this out of reference into a regular layer so that I can select it and make sure that I've got it turned into a live surface. All right, now that the sculpture is a live surface, we can go into our modeling toolkit here on the right side. And the tool you use the most in here is probably going to be Quad Draw. So let's zoom in on the face and see what happens when we select Quad Draw. Okay, so what this does is it allows us to create vertices that can then be turned into polygons. So really it's just a matter of clicking in the sections where the guidelines overlap. So you can see now I've just drawn out 4 vertices. Now to create a polygon, what I can do is hold down Shift, and what the modeling toolkit will do is try to identify areas where there's 4 vertices that could be turned into a polygon. So this is sort of giving us a preview of what that polygon will look like. So if I just click on it, that will lock it into being actual geometry. Now you'll notice it created this polygon on only one side of the model. Now there is a symmetry option over here that we can turn on to Object X or World X. Our object is centered with the world, so it probably shouldn't matter which one of these we choose. And you can use this. However, I have found that it sometimes creates some weird glitches. Maybe not while you're creating the polygons, but if you're editing anything close to that center line, there can be some weird things happening. So what I like to do is just create the geometry on half of the model. And then when I'm all done creating the new topology, I'll just flip and mirror. So we'll go over that later in the course. You can use symmetry if you want, but just be aware that there might be some weird glitches to deal with. So I'll just hit Control Z to undo that. And we'll go back into symmetry and turn that off. Okay, let's do this a few more times. So I'll just create some more vertices here. And then once you've created that, you can hold down Shift, and the toolkit again will notice the 2 vertices that were already turned into geometry here and combine it with these 2 that we clicked out and allow us to create another one. So just clicking on this preview creates a new polygon. So you can either turn these into polygons as you go, or you can just go ahead and click out a whole bunch of vertices and eventually end up with a lot of vertices that you can go through then and turn into polygons later. So just holding down Shift and clicking through that. However you want to do it, whatever works for you, that's great. Just notice that every once in a while there's some weird things that might happen. So let's just say we've created all these And maybe if you're looking at it from a strange angle or something, you can get some strange effects like this. Notice how it's trying to create that preview in a way that's not actually what we might want. So you just want to make sure that you've got that preview actually showing the polygon that you want to create. Now, what might happen is sometimes, especially if the view angle is a little bit extreme, it might not allow you to create that polygon at all. So you might have to move your view around a little bit until it will create the polygon you want. Now, sometimes it doesn't even matter how much you move that view around, it might not create the polygon you want, especially if you've got some vertices really close together. So I'm just clicking and dragging on some of these vertices to move them. And let's just say, for example, that this, right now it is giving us the polygon preview that we want, but let's say for the sake of argument that it wasn't. What you might want to do is click and drag on some of these and move them a little bit further apart, and then create that polygon and then move them back to where they should be. So that's just a little trick to get around some glitches that happen sometimes. So just go ahead and establish the rest of the polygons around the eye and the mouth. So that's the basics of making a retopologized mesh. You could almost finish the entire model with just these few functions alone. However, in the rest of the chapter, we'll get into some of the more fancy tricks you can do. Here's another way to make geometry in addition to the way we learned in the last video. This technique builds off of polygons that already exist. So let's see how. A quick note about loading files. Just like with the live surface mode, Maya doesn't remember if you were in the quad draw tool when you save. So if you're loading an exercise file or your own file, you'll need to get back into the quad draw tool under the modeling toolkit in order to see what I see on my screen. Once you've already got some geometry created, sometimes you're going to find that new geometry that you want to create is basically an extension off of what you already have. So there's a few ways to do this. Usually it's done by holding down the Tab key. So let's hold down Tab and then just click and drag from some of these edges and just pull out some new geometry. So instead of clicking out new vertices and filling them with polygons, we just hold down Tab and click and drag. Now you'll notice it pulls out a very separate polygon. It's not really connecting to the one next to it. However, there is a snap tolerance. So if we bring it close enough, that one corner close enough to the one we already extended out, it'll snap. And then we can just move that one vertex up where it should go. So you could continue this around just holding down Tab, clicking it out, and you could maybe click it out like this and then drag until it snaps. So on and so forth all the way around. Now there's another way to do this, and that's by extending entire edge loops at once. So if we look at the structure of this, you can see that this set of edges right here form an edge loop. By the time it reaches this vertex, it changes angle. So this set of edges and this edge right here aren't included in this edge loop. So what that means is if we hold down Tab and now use a middle mouse click, what'll happen is that it extrudes out that whole edge at once. Now you'll notice it's extending them all in the same direction. And this is actually an area where the flow zone kind of curves around. So once you create it, you'll definitely have to come through and readjust some of the positions, but it is handy in that it creates all of those new polygons at once. Now sometimes this might not be exactly what you want. You might think that you could use that same technique down here, and let's try it. Let's hold down Tab, use the middle mouse, click and drag. And so what happens is it kind of works for a little bit, but since that edge loop really curves around a lot, Maya isn't really exactly sure how to handle that once you go past a certain point. So you come out very far and things start to get glitchy and corrupted. So that might not necessarily be the feature that's best for this. It can work a little bit here. Once you drag that out, then you could drag this up until it snaps up there, drag that up, so on and so forth, until you create something that looks pretty decent. So it's not the best way to do this, but it's also not the worst. So we'll just go ahead and drag the rest of those out. Okay, looking good. Now there's one more way to use this that I like, and that's by changing the extend options here. So by holding down Tab and clicking and dragging, it's currently set to extrude just a single edge. But if we change this to border, now watch what happens. Let's hold down Tab, click and drag, and now what this does is it extends that entire border out, but instead of doing it in one direction, it does it relative to the direction of the surface. So this way we can get these polygons creating new loops on the inside of the eye. So we'll just do this a couple more times. Now once you get the inside of the eye to this point, don't worry about filling it all the rest of the way in. This is going to be covered up by the eyeball and you'll never see it. Also, it's useful to keep this edge open and this space hollow because we're going to be inserting edge loops occasionally. So if we insert an edge loop right here, for example, we want it to be able to end right here without extending and creating more geometry on the other side. This helps us to localize where extra geometry goes. Alright, so go ahead and practice on your own, extending some more of these edges to fill out more of this face. And don't worry if this technique creates results that are too glitchy. You can just go ahead and do it the old-fashioned way that we learned in the last video. We never made guidelines for the ear, so does that mean that we have to go back and make some before retopologizing it? Not at all. Unless the ear on your model needs to do a lot of fancy, specific animation, the topology for it doesn't have to be as specific as for with the eyes and mouth. We can mostly just figure it out as we go. So I've got my exercise file here with the face already started. I've got it in quad draw mode with the elf sculpt in live surface mode. So I'm just going to jump right in and start laying out some polygons. Actually just laying out some points where these vertices are going to go. So I'm not being super specific or precise with this. Just laying things out where they might end up going and just holding down shift here and creating some of these polygons as I go. So I do want to try to capture some of these sharper edges. So I'm just laying out points accordingly for that. And it looks like there's a little bit of a sharper edge here. So I'll just lay out points to help hold this. And it looks like this sharper edge kind of comes down to this area and then dies off. And we got a little bit of a sharper edge here. So I'm just going to come through and try to define that. And it looks like this loop continues around up here. So kind of jumping around, just trying to find the areas that are most obvious to work from. And I'm also trying to think about how these different parts might line up with each other. So we've got an edge here and it's probably going to connect up with this one. So if I lay out my points like this, I can create a new polygon that connects them right there. And it looks like a nice polygon would fit in there. So really I'm just kind of feeling my way through it. Let's see, a polygon might come in here. And that's okay if we create a triangle there. It's not a big deal. It's not an area that's going to deform very much. And that triangle is not sitting on an area of great detail, so it should be okay. So I'm just plugging away at it some more. Just adding in new polygons, just seeing what happens. And I can try to think about reducing some of this. I've got a lot of edges coming out of here, and I don't necessarily need all this detail coming down into this earlobe. So what I can do is try to reduce some of this. So if I put one vertex there, I can create a polygon right here that kind of closes that off. So it turns these three into one. And we'll just make a few more around here. Actually, I didn't want to do that. That connected in an awkward place. So let me create another one here. Okay, so that's the basics of the ear. We can go ahead and keep extending this out around the back side of the ear, but I'll let you handle that part on your own. Now, one nice thing about this is that you can work on the ear by itself without attaching it to the head for right now. Sometimes when I'm feeling confident, I'll do an entire character freehand like this without any guidelines. Feel free to continue working on it on your own. As you work, you'll probably find that you need to increase detail or remove polygons that aren't working. In this video, I'll show you the quick shortcuts to make that happen. In my exercise file, you can see that I have several sections retopologized independently of each other. This is a great way to work, but eventually they will need to be connected. Ideally, they should connect as smoothly as possible. Let's take a look at a few of these situations and how to solve them by adding or removing polygons and edge loops. Okay, so one thing you might notice right off the bat is that there's not necessarily the same number of edge loops on either side of the divide between these various retopologized sections. So for example, if we look at the number of edge loops coming up off of the forehead, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in the back of the head, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a couple ways to go about solving this. One is to add edge loops to one side. The other is to remove edge loops from the other side. And the third solution is to create what's called a reduction, where you keep the same number of edge loops on each side, but you create a specific pattern in between in order to join them. First, let's remove an edge loop on the top of the head to make it match up with the forehead. So it's really simple. All we do is delete an edge loop, and that's done by holding down Control and Shift and clicking on an edge loop. So now we've got the same number of edge loops on each side, and now we can simply hold down Shift and create these polygons to bridge the gap. Now let's look at a way of adding edge loops. So let's come around to the back side, and you can see that we might want to connect up this strip of polygons with this, but you can see that we've got more polygons, more edge loops on the back of the head than we do on the back of the neck. So let's add edge loops by holding down Control and clicking on some of these polygons. Okay, now we can do as before, just holding down Shift and clicking out some new polygons to fill those gaps. Okay, looking good. Let's look at some more scenarios around the ear, for example. So this gets a little bit more complicated, and there's lots of different ways to solve this using a combination of adding edge loops, subtracting edge loops, and using reductions. So I want to connect this strip of polygons up with the ear, but it looks like if I hold down Shift and add one here, it's a little bit of an awkward connection here. So let me just undo that. And it looks like I might want to add another edge loop here anyway. It's just looking kind of thin in this area. So if I just hold down Control and add an edge loop there, you can see now we have more geometry to work with. So let's try to just make a new polygon here and a new polygon here. Okay, looks good. So there's another scenario with the eye. It's relatively low definition right here, especially for the corner of the eye. You want to have some extra geometry there in case the eyelid needs to close and you need to have that geometry for the deformation of the eyelid, especially in the corner of the eye. So let's go ahead and add one here and add one here. So now we have some more edge loops to work with. And I'll create one here. Okay, so it looks like we've got a scenario here where there's two edges coming in here, but only one on this side. Now we could add another edge here, but it's starting to get a little bit dense. So let's delete this edge. So I'm just going to hold down Control and Shift and click on that edge loop. And now we can fill this in. Okay, so now let's take a look at what's called a reduction, where we keep the same number of edge loops on each side, but we create a specific pattern that helps us to bridge the gap. So one of these can be done by filling in gaps that seem pretty obvious, and then leaving some in between that might be less obvious. So what we have here is these two edge loops coming in where there's no edge loops on the other side. So one way to solve this is by creating a polygon right there and leaving two triangles on either side. Now if we hold down Shift, you see we get a purple preview, and that means that it's going to create a triangle there. Now when we've got two triangles, what we can do is insert an edge loop between them, and what this does is it results in four-sided polygons all around. So we still maintain the same number of edge loops on the top and the same number of edge loops in the ear, and we just used what's called a reduction to manage that connection between them. Let's take a look at another type of reduction. So I'm going to fill in an obvious gap here, and I'll just fill in this one as well, and I'll also fill in this gap here. All right, and then all we have to do is fill in this one. And so what we have is two strips of polygons that are coming in, and then they're meeting in a point where there's really no more polygons for them to connect up with. So it creates the 5-pointed star here, and then we get a 4-sided polygon here. So this is another type of reduction in addition to this type. I typically like this type better because it's a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater. This type is okay, but it does create a little bit more extra geometry. Okay, let's just fill in the last bit here. So there's a lot of ways we could go about solving this. Sometimes I like to just start trying out different things and seeing what works. And I might have to undo and try it a different way, but it's always a fun experiment to see how this might work. So let's see, just trying to insert some more polygons here, and that's actually not too bad. But let's say we didn't like that very much and we want to redo it. You could undo, or you could just selectively delete some of these by holding down Control and Shift and clicking on a polygon. And you can actually delete multiples at once, so just hold down Control, Shift, and then click and drag over all of the polygons you want to delete. So we could actually try solving this a different way. Maybe by doing something kind of like this. Okay, so you can see that by adding and deleting edge loops and deleting polygons, we can figure out a really good way to connect various parts of the topology to each other. I use these features all the time to increase mesh density or to fix problems. Now that the overall mesh for the head is done, we can go in and selectively increase detail in certain areas that should be sharper or conform to the sculpt more closely. For this, we'll use inserted edge loops like we have before, but also use a new tool called multicut. Let's see how. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the area around the eyes. So you can see in the raw sculpt that there's kind of a tight crease around the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. And currently we have one edge loop in that area. If we add another edge loop, it'll help tighten up a crease right there. So this can simply be done the same way we've been doing it before. I'll just come in here and hold down Control and add a new edge loop. Now let's visualize this a little bit better. It can be hard to see exactly what kind of effect this extra edge loop is having on the model. So what we can do is we can go out of the quad draw tool. Also, we can get back into object mode by holding down the right mouse button and going up to object mode in the marking menu. Next, let's go to the channel box and layer editor and make sure we've hidden the guides layer and the raw sculpt. Now there's a little bit of a bug in Maya 2018. It might not show it as visible, but still be visible. So sometimes that V won't be visible, but you can still see the object. So just clicking on that a few times will reset that. Next, let's turn on smoothing for this model. Hit 3 on the keyboard. Okay, let's deselect the model just by clicking in an open area. And you can see it's actually a little bit hard to see right now. The material is very matte without much of shine on it. So let's add a shinier material to it by holding down the right mouse button on the model, going down to Assign Favorite Material and picking Blend. Okay, with these highlights we can see more clearly what's going on here. So you can see with that extra edge added, it makes a nice crease around the lower eyelid and the upper eyelid. However, it's kind of making an awkward crease on the sides of the eyes. So all we have to do is just manually tweak some of those edges to spread them apart a little bit, and that should fix that. So let's go back into our modeling toolkit. I'm going to hit 1 on the keyboard to turn off that smooth preview. And let's go back into our modeling toolkit and go back to quad draw. And then simply what we can do here is kind of space apart some of these edges at the sides of the eyes. So we'll keep that nice crease going at the top and the bottom, and then we'll spread it out on the sides. Now, even though we have our raw sculpt hidden, it's still being taken into account with the modeling toolkit, the quad draw. So these vertices are still snapping to that surface, even though we can't see it. All right, looks good. Okay, let's look at another area that needs sharper edges. So over here in the ear, there are sharper edges. If you remember when we retopologized this, there was a sharp edge here and a sharp edge here, and then also a sharper edge around here. Now, the thing about these sharp edges is that they should die off at a certain point. We don't want to continue an edge loop all the way out and around the whole rest of the model just to sharpen these areas. So let's selectively do that with the multi-cut tool. So let's create an edge that comes around and sharpens up, creates a holding edge around this section right here. So I'm just clicking and dragging on edges. I like to click a little bit farther away from that vertex and then draw it in. It's just kind of an easier way to do it. If you click here, you can kind of pull it away as well. It really doesn't matter. But I just want to create this holding edge here that's going to tighten up that crease. Okay, let's bring it down there. And then one thing we can do is actually create new vertices in the middle of polygons. Now we only want to do that temporarily. We do eventually want to bring this back. And then if we right click with the mouse button, it will lock that in so that when I finish this off, we can just click from here to here and finish that off, and then right click to lock in that new edge. And then we'll draw one more from here to here, which will restore this to being 4-sided polygons. Okay, so now we'll have a sharper creased edge here, and now let's get one going for these two edges here. So just manually clicking these out. Oops, it looks like I accidentally snapped that one too close, so let me pull it out a little bit. Okay, looks good. And we'll bring it down to there, and then right click to lock that in, and let's do that one more time for this edge here. And it can be a little bit tricky if you accidentally click on that vertex. You have to pull it out away a little bit. Okay, and now what we can do is we can just finish up this last one and bring it down to this vertex. So when we right click and lock that in, you can see now we have a 4-sided polygon here and a 4-sided polygon here. Let's do the same thing up here. So we can draw from this vertex up to here, and right click to lock that in. And actually, you know what? I'm going to undo that because you'll notice it's now creating a 6-pointed star right here on this vertex, and that can create some weird artifacts. So let's just hit Control Z to undo that, and let's draw this from the other side down to that point. Okay, great. So now it's a 5-pointed star here and a 5-pointed star here. That's going to be better for preventing artifacts from showing up. There can be weird pinching in the model that's visible if you have a 6-pointed star. Okay, there's one last area that needs holding edges, and that is around the smile line here next to the mouth, and then a little bit under the nose. But I'll let you handle that on your own. Okay, so with holding edges, the basic idea is that when two edges are close together, they make a crease. Now this can take some fine-tuning and trial and error to get right, so make sure you practice some on your own. As you build in more and more geometry, you'll probably find that it doesn't always get created with even spacing. Some edges are much closer together than others for no good reason, apart from the holding edges we created in the last video, of course. The Quad Draw tool has a smoothing mode that makes it easy to even out the mesh. So let's try it out. So just taking a look around the model, you can see where we added some of these edges in. We've got some that are kind of clustered together here, and then a bigger space, then some that are clustered together, so on and so forth. So this is pretty easy to work out. Just simply hold down the Shift key and you go into relax mode when you've got Quad Draw selected. And so you just click and sculpt, and these edges will just basically smooth and spread themselves out. Now you do want to be careful in some areas. Maybe you do want these edges to be close together like we established in the last video, so you don't want to smooth on top of those so much. So I'm going to undo that. But we do want to smooth around in some of these areas. Kind of relax this out. And then definitely here in the back of the head, we'll want to smooth this out. Now there's a couple settings to keep in mind when you're using the relax function. And that is by default, it's not going to relax any vertices that are on the borders. So what can happen is that you'll be relaxing and the ones on the border will stay where they are, and that may or may not be what you want. So one way around that is to just manually move these vertices. So you can just kind of grab them and just pull them where you want them to go. Another way around this is to go down to the options. Under Relax, it's set to auto lock by default. We could change this to all vertices. So let's see what happens when you use this. Now those border vertices are being relaxed as well. Now the issue with that is that it can sort of pull these vertices away from the center line. Now we're going to be fixing this later on and mirroring the model and snapping all of these right into the center. So it's probably not a huge deal if they move a little bit, but if you don't want them to move, you might want to change this to auto lock or interior vertices. So usually I like to just keep it on auto lock and then just move those border vertices manually. So we'll just come through and relax some more of this. And it looks like we can relax some down here. And actually I'm just going to spread these apart manually. The nasal labial fold crease kind of dies off after roughly this point. So we don't really need to keep those tight together past the mouth. Okay, we're just going to rearrange this a little bit. So it's kind of a manual relaxing. Okay, so looks like we mostly got everything that needs to be relaxed, but go ahead and look around, see if there's any other areas that could use it as well. And this is something that I like to do regularly. after this point, you can still insert edge loops, you can still move things around, and you might want to just pick up that relax at any point and just kind of help spread those things out to be a little bit more natural. We're really getting far along in the model now. You can certainly do a great retopology job with what we've learned so far, but there are some advanced techniques that can make the process even faster. Let's see how. Now for this, I'm going to work on the hip region. I'm going to start with a new mesh rather than build within the existing head mesh. And we'll see why I'm doing this later on. But for right now, I'm just going to deselect the head mesh that we've been working on. And I want to make sure that the sculpt is in live mode. So if it's not already, go ahead and make it live. And so if we go back into modeling tools and go to quad draw, if we start making new topology without a model selected, it's going to put it into a new mesh. So I'm just going to go ahead and start making a new topology just like I've done before. Just making new vertices and new polygons. So this part is pretty straightforward, same thing we've been doing before. So I'm going to skip ahead now to a point where the hip is done. Okay, so you can see I have the basic hip completed. It's very low density right now. So one thing I want to do is continue this geometry and extend this down the leg. So what can often happen is you've got topology on a large area of the model, and that has to squeeze down into an area that's actually quite small. And what can happen in these areas is that all these edges start to get bunched up together. So we can do a reduction in this area, but let's do it a different way than we've done before. Because this geometry is so low poly, I'm going to use a special trick here. So let's zoom in on this area, and let's say we want to get rid of this edge. Now there's a new way to do it, and that's just by hovering over it while you've got quad draw active and hitting the delete key on your keyboard. Now we also need to get rid of this little vertex that was left behind back here, so I'll just hit delete over that as well. So what we're left with is a 5-sided polygon. Now usually you might be thinking that this is really bad news because you don't want to have 5-sided polygons in your model, and you would be correct. However, because this model is so low poly, what we can do is subdivide the entire model at once. And subdivision turns all polys into 4-sided polygons. So let's get out of quad draw mode. And we also want to get out of our polygon mode, so just go ahead and hold down the right mouse button and go to object mode in your marking menu. And now click on add divisions. So you can see that the 5-sided polygon actually got turned into all quads, and it created this reduction structure that we've looked at in previous videos. All right, let's go back into quad draw. So you can see it's actually quite angular. It didn't actually smooth it out when it added divisions, but this is also easy to address. Let's hold down Shift and go into relax mode. Now relax mode, as we go over these vertices, you can see that it's actually snapping them to the sculpt model. But we can do this even faster. So let's hit B to turn on soft selection mode. We can even change the size of this soft selection area by holding down B and then clicking and dragging left and right. And you can see as we go left and right, we're increasing and decreasing the area that's affected by the soft selection. So if we get a pretty big soft selection here, and we just hold down Shift to go into relax mode, you can see that everything is sort of shrink wrapping to that surface as we go around. So this makes it very easy to just snap all of these vertices onto that live surface. Now we can even use soft selection without relax. We could use it with move, for example. So if we just simply click and drag on parts of this model, you can see we're moving it and kind of shifting it around on the model, and it stays snapped onto that live surface. So we can kind of shift things around a little bit, and everything stays snapped onto the sculpt. So this is a really handy way to make big adjustments to the positioning of these polygons. Now if you want to turn off soft select, simply hit B again. Okay, now that we've got this hip done, let's combine it with the head. So I'll go up to the select tool, and we'll just select the head, and let's get out of component mode, just holding down the right mouse button, going to object mode, and then we'll shift click on the hip. We'll go to mesh and combine. Okay, so in this video, we saw how to quickly delete single edges and vertices with the delete key. We also saw how to create edge loop reductions with a new method by subdividing a 5-sided polygon. We saw how to quickly add extra density by dividing the whole model at once. And finally, how to make big changes with soft selection. Go ahead and use everything you've learned to complete the rest of the body. Now that we're done with half the body, let's mirror it over to the other half. Once that's done, you'll still be able to make symmetrical changes. So let's see how. Okay, so if we take a closer look at the borderline of the model, you can see it's a little bit jagged. As we were working on this, we didn't take any special precautions to make sure that any of these vertices were perfectly aligned with the center, which is fine. We don't need to do that. But we should fix it before we mirror it. So let's get out of quad draw mode. And we should be able to double click on one of these border edges, and that should select all of these edges all the way around the model. Now, depending on how you built this mouth, you might need to deselect some edges. Let's say, for example, if you built the mouth not totally closed off on the inside, but kind of open like the eyes are, you would want to deselect those edges that aren't meeting with the center line. Okay, now that you've got this selection made, we can hit R to go into scale mode, and we just want to scale these edges so that they all snap into a perfect vertical alignment. And now we just hit W to go into move mode, and what we can do is hold down X to go into snap mode so it snaps to the grid, and we just want to move this not too far, otherwise it'll snap too far to the wrong side or too far to the other side, but right in the middle. So now we know that all of these vertices are perfectly aligned with the center of the world. Okay, so we can get out of component mode holding down the right mouse button, going up to object mode in the marking menu. And now to mirror it over, let's go to mesh and mirror with options. So there's a few options we want to change here or make sure we've got set correctly. We want to keep cut geometry turned on. That's going to make sure that it cuts right down the middle and flips it over. Mirror axis position should be world. We should have the model built so that it's built right on the middle of the world. And mirror axis X, yes. And if we built the character with the right side of the character built out, then we want to mirror in the positive direction. If for some reason you had built it starting on the other side of the model, then you would want to switch this to negative. But since we built it on the right side of the model or left side of the screen, we're going to use positive. We want to turn on merge border vertices and turn on combine with original. Everything else should be good, so go ahead and click apply. And we can close this window. Okay, so you can see that we've now got the other half of the model. And just to make sure that everything worked correctly, let's turn on subdivision preview by hitting 3 on the keyboard. Okay, so let's go ahead and hide the original sculpt and those guidelines and just make sure that everything looks okay. So you might run into some issues where things look a little pinched or a little strange, and this happens when things that shouldn't have been merged got merged. So let's see how to fix this. Or it could also be a stray vertex caught in the middle. Let's see what happened with this. So I'm going to hold down the right mouse button and go to vertex. Yeah, and you can see there's a stray vertex that shouldn't have been there. So I'm just going to click on that and delete it by hitting the delete key. And we can actually do that with a few of these others where there's some strange things happening. Not that it matters so much on the inside of the mouth where you're not really going to see it, but it can help clean things up a little bit. Let's see, it looks like there's one more up here. And if we wanted to, we could even collapse this edge. So we go to mesh, or edit mesh rather, and collapse. And that will just take that edge and just collapse it into a single point. Same thing with this. I'll just hit G on the keyboard to repeat that last function and just collapse that edge. It's a little bit neater now, not that that makes a big difference. Okay, so you want to check the model all over, especially along the borderline, just make sure nothing weird happened. And then once that's done, we can actually go back into our quad draw mode. And if you want to make changes here, you can still do whatever you would have done before, but we want to make sure that symmetry is turned on now. So let's go to symmetry, and either world X or object X, it doesn't matter because the object is centered with the world. And so now if we want to insert edge loops, we could do that. We could do anything we had done before, but now we can do it symmetrically. So the reason I started with half the body rather than using symmetry from the beginning is that there are sometimes glitches in the process of working symmetrically within the modeling toolkit and the quad draw. However, you're free to try it out anyway, and if it works, then you won't have to do this step at the end. And that's it, the model is complete. Since a lot of the work on this guy was redundant, I skipped ahead on some of it. However, there are a few things we can examine in order to understand the riggable topology more fully. So let's check it out. One area that I skipped ahead on was the hand. And you can see it's pretty standard. It looks fairly grid-like, pretty simple. But there are a few things that can help you make these fingers more efficiently. One thing I did is make sure that each finger had 8 edge loops going down the length of it. And this results in a nice end cap that has 4 polygons on it. Now if you have 5 or 6 or 7 or 9 edge loops going down the finger, that can also work too, but it can become a little bit more cumbersome or tedious to make nice end caps on the fingers. 6 edge loops actually can work as well. Something else I want to look at is the wrist. Now there were a lot of edge loops coming off the hand and coming into this smaller, tighter area. So we don't need so many edge loops running down the arm. So I made reductions here, as you can see. Now one thing you want to do is put reductions in areas that aren't going to deform a whole lot. So the forearm is a rigid part of the anatomy, so it's not going to deform so much. So we want to keep the area where it will deform right here in the wrist more clean and straightforward. So I let some of these extra edges come down into the forearm somewhat and then reduce them. Something else we can look at is the number of edge loops in areas that will deform, like the elbow and the knees. So you can see right here where the knees will bend, I put edge loops a little closer together. This will give us some extra geometry so that when the knee bends, it won't deform in an unnatural or ugly way. And that's it. Of course, every character is different, so the way you create topology can depend not only on the forms of the character, but also the way it will be animated and how clothing or props might interact with it. So always make sure you check with the person who will be rigging the model so that you can know about anything special that should be done with the topology. Congratulations on completing this course! With a model like this, you're ready to put him into the animation pipeline. You can take the next step by rigging the character. Learn how by watching Character Rigging in Maya with George Maestri. Also, you might want to learn how to sculpt and add all kinds of detail by watching my ZBrush Essential Training course. Well, that's it. I hope you learned a lot about how to take a character sculpt and make it ready for rigging. See you next time.